The Sacred Journey, Holy Week's path from triumph to resurrection. Beginnings, the weight of Holy Week. The sacred days we call Holy Week represent much more than historical events preserved in ancient texts. They form the very foundation of Christian faith, a dramatic, world-changing week that began with celebration and descended into darkness before erupting in the most profound victory ever witnessed. Each moment of this week pulses with meaning, each scene revealing another facet of divine love expressed through sacrifice and ultimately resurrection. The final week of Jesus' earthly ministry contains humanity's entire story. Our hopes and failures, our capacity for both devotion and betrayal, and ultimately, our desperate need for redemption. These events transformed history not merely because they happened, but because they continue to happen in the hearts of those who contemplate their meaning. The triumph of Palm Sunday, the confrontations in the temple, the intimate teachings, the betrayal and arrest, the cruel execution, and the world-shattering resurrection. Each element speaks to fundamental human experiences and our deepest longings. As we journey through Holy Week together, I invite you not merely to observe these events, but to place yourself within them. Imagine the dust of Jerusalem's streets beneath your feet, the press of the crowds around you, the weight of mounting tension in the air. Listen for the nuances in Jesus' voice as he delivers his final teachings. Feel the confusion and despair of the disciples as their world collapses, and then the indescribable wonder as death itself is defeated. This week matters because it reveals the lengths to which God would go to restore relationship with humanity. It demonstrates that love is stronger than hatred, that light overcomes darkness, and that even death itself cannot have the final word. The story of Holy Week is not merely about what happened then. It's about what continues to happen now as its power transforms lives across centuries and cultures. So let us begin our journey at the gates of Jerusalem, where crowds gather with branches in hand, voices raised in celebration, unaware that their cries of Hosanna will soon transform into demands for crucifixion. Let us walk deliberately through each day, allowing the full weight and wonder of this sacred week to reshape our understanding of sacrifice, love, and resurrection power. Palm Sunday, the humble king arrives. The morning air buzzed with anticipation as crowds began gathering along the road leading into Jerusalem. Passover was approaching, the most significant festival of the Jewish year, and pilgrims had flooded the holy city from every corner of the empire. But this year, something different was happening. Rumors had spread rapidly. Jesus of Nazareth was coming, the miracle worker who had raised Lazarus from the dead just days earlier in nearby Bethany. The air crackled with expectation. Rachel, a young mother from Galilee, had positioned herself and her children at a curve in the road where they could clearly see the approaching procession. She had heard Jesus teach by the shores of a lake near her home and had witnessed him heal the blind man in her village. "Watch carefully, children," she whispered. "Many believe he may be the promised Messiah." Unlike royal processions with their armed guards, ornate chariots, and displays of imperial power, Jesus' approach was markedly different. The crowd spotted him coming down the Mount of Olives, not on a stallion bristling with martial power, but seated on a young donkey, fulfilling the ancient words of the prophet Zechariah, who had written, "Rejoice greatly, O daughter Zion. Shout aloud, O daughter Jerusalem. Lo, your king comes to you. Triumphant and victorious is he, humble and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey." As Jesus approached, a spontaneous celebration erupted. The crowd, driven by generations of messianic longing, began spreading their cloaks on the ground before him, an ancient gesture acknowledging royalty. Others cut leafy branches from palm trees and waved them, creating a swaying canopy of green. The atmosphere transformed into one of unbridled jubilation as shouts filled the air. "Hosanna to the Son of David! Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord! Hosanna in the highest!" The word Hosanna rang with particular significance. It meant "save us now," in Hebrew, a cry both of praise and desperate petition. The people were welcoming Jesus as the long-awaited deliverer who would restore David's kingdom and overthrow Roman oppression. The political implications of their celebration weren't lost on anyone present, least of all the temple authorities and Roman officials watching warily from a distance. Yet amid the celebration, Jesus' expression remained complex, joy mingled with profound sadness. Luke's gospel tells us that as Jerusalem came into view, Jesus wept over the city, saying, "If you had only recognized on this day the things that make for peace, but now they are hidden from your eyes." His tears revealed the tragedy unfolding. The people welcomed him as king, but fundamentally misunderstood the nature of his kingdom. The crowd wanted a conquering Messiah who would defeat Rome through military might. Jesus came instead as the Prince of Peace, riding a humble donkey, his weapons not swords but sacrificial love. The palm branches they waved symbolized nationalist hopes for victory. Jesus saw instead his approaching cross. Their vision of salvation was political liberation. His was spiritual transformation that would transcend all earthly kingdoms. As the procession wound through narrow streets toward the temple, religious leaders pushed through the crowd, demanding that Jesus silence his followers. "Teacher, rebuke your disciples," they insisted, recognizing the messianic implications of the celebration. Jesus' response was both simple and profound. "I tell you, if these were silent, the very stones would cry out." Creation itself would testify if human voices failed. The contrast between appearance and reality defined this first day of Holy Week. The crowds saw the beginning of a political revolution. Jesus knew it was the start of his sacrificial journey to the cross. They anticipated the overthrow of Rome. He prepared for the overthrow of sin and death. They expected the immediate restoration of Israel. He foresaw the eventual redemption of all creation. As evening approached, Jesus entered the temple complex, the beating heart of Jewish religious life, and observed everything happening there. Mark's gospel tells us he looked around at everything, but since it was late, he returned with his disciples to Bethany where they were staying. This quiet observation foreshadowed the dramatic action that would unfold the next day. Palm Sunday reminds us that appearances can be deceiving. The crowd's enthusiasm was genuine but misguided. They wanted a savior who would conform to their expectations rather than transform their hearts. 2,000 years later, we face the same temptation, to shape Jesus according to our desires rather than allowing him to reshape us according to his kingdom values. The true significance of Palm Sunday lies not in the crowd's misunderstood celebration, but in Jesus' deliberate choice to present himself as king while simultaneously embracing the path to the cross. He didn't correct their hosannas because their acclaim, though misunderstood, contained a deeper truth than they realized. He was indeed their king, just not the kind they expected. His kingdom would come not through conquering, but through serving, not by taking life, but by giving his own. As the sun set on that first day of Holy Week, few in Jerusalem understood what was truly happening. The disciples themselves, despite years with Jesus, still expected a political revolution. Only Jesus fully comprehended the road ahead, that the palms of Sunday would give way to the thorns of Friday, and that true victory would come in a way no one anticipated. Monday, confrontation in the temple. The morning sun illuminated Jerusalem's limestone buildings as Jesus and his disciples made their way back to the city from Bethany. The disciples still buzzed with excitement from the previous day's triumphal entry, but Jesus' demeanor had grown increasingly solemn. Something weighed heavily on his mind as they approached the massive temple complex, the pride of Jerusalem and the center of Jewish worship. From a distance, the temple was breathtaking, its white marble and gold ornamentation gleaming in the morning light. Herod the Great had spared no expense in its renovation, creating one of the architectural wonders of the ancient world. Yet as Jesus drew closer, It wasn't the building's beauty that captured his attention, but the scene unfolding within its outer courts. The court of the Gentiles, the only area where non-Jews could come to pray and learn about the God of Israel, had been transformed into a noisy marketplace. Money changers sat at tables, exchanging impure Roman currency for temple coins at exploitative rates. Merchants sold sacrificial animals at inflated prices. The combination of bleating sheep, cooing doves, shouting vendors, and the clink of coins created a chaotic atmosphere that made prayer impossible. What should have been sacred space had become a place of profit and exploitation. Worshippers from distant lands who had traveled for weeks were being taken advantage of in God's very house. Those who controlled the temple had effectively blocked access to God for the very nations they were supposed to welcome. Aaron, a merchant visiting from Alexandria, stood at the edge of the court, his jaw tight with anger. He had saved for years to make this pilgrimage, only to find the outer court, his only permitted access to the temple, transformed into a noisy marketplace where prayer was impossible. This is not what the prophet Isaiah meant when he wrote that God's house would be a house of prayer for all nations, he muttered to his companion. Jesus observed this scene, and righteous indignation rose within him. This wasn't merely about noise or commerce. It represented the corruption of Israel's spiritual leaders who had turned worship into profit and excluded the very people God wanted to welcome. With deliberate purpose, Jesus approached one of the money changers' tables. The disciples watched in astonishment as he flipped it over, sending coins scattering across the stone pavement. "Take these things away," Jesus commanded, his voice carrying across the suddenly quieting court. "Stop making my Father's house a marketplace." He overturned more tables and opened cages, releasing doves into the sky. He fashioned a whip from cords and drove the livestock from the area, declaring with prophetic authority, "It is written, 'My house shall be called a house of prayer for all nations,' but you have made it a den of robbers." The symbolism was unmistakable. This wasn't a spontaneous outburst, but a carefully calculated prophetic act. By cleansing the temple, Jesus was enacting judgment against a religious system that had become corrupt and exclusive rather than holy and welcoming. He was fulfilling Malachi's prophecy. The Lord whom you seek will suddenly come to his temple. The temple authorities, the chief priests, scribes, and elders, were furious. Not only had Jesus disrupted their profitable arrangement, but he had directly challenged their authority by claiming the right to determine what was appropriate in God's house. More disturbing still, he had referred to the temple as my Father's house, implying a unique relationship with God that bordered on blasphemy in their eyes. "By what authority are you doing these things?" they demanded, confronting Jesus after the initial chaos had subsided. "Who gave you this authority?" Jesus responded with his own question. The baptism of John, was it from heaven or from humans? This simple query created a dilemma for his opponents. If they acknowledged John's authority came from heaven, they would have to explain why they rejected his message and his testimony about Jesus. If they denied John's divine authority, they risked angering the crowds who revered John as a prophet. After conferring among themselves, they gave the cowardly answer, "We do not know. Neither will I tell you by what authority I do these things," Jesus replied, exposing their dishonesty. They hadn't come seeking truth, but looking to trap him. As the confrontation subsided, people began gathering around Jesus. Children sang, "Hosanna to the Son of David," echoing the previous day's acclamations. When the chief priests objected, Jesus quoted Psalm 8. "From the lips of children and infants you, Lord, have called forth your praise." Throughout the remainder of that day, Jesus remained in the temple courts, teaching the people and healing the blind and lame who came to him. His presence transformed the space from a marketplace back into a place of genuine ministry. The temple authorities watched helplessly, unable to arrest him because of his popularity with the crowds. "See, this is getting us nowhere," they said to one another. "Look how the whole world has gone after him." As evening approached, Jesus and his disciples left the city and returned to Bethany. The The temple authorities, humiliated and threatened by the day's events, began plotting in earnest. Something had to be done about this Galilean teacher who challenged their authority and threatened their power. The confrontation in the temple had escalated the conflict to a point of no return. Monday of Holy Week reveals Jesus not as a passive victim, but as one who deliberately provoked a confrontation with corrupt religious power. His cleansing of the temple wasn't merely about inappropriate commerce. It was a prophetic act declaring judgment against a system that had become exploitative and exclusive. He challenged the very institutions that claimed to represent God, but had become barriers to genuine worship. This day also highlights the courage of Jesus. He knew that confronting the powerful temple establishment would accelerate the timeline toward his arrest and execution, yet he did not hesitate. His actions in the temple courts were not those of someone trying to avoid conflict, but of one deliberately forcing a reckoning. The question, by what authority, continues to echo across centuries. The religious leaders couldn't recognize divine authority standing before them because they were too invested in their own power. Similar blindness affects us when our comfort, status, or traditions become more important than truth. The temple cleansing invites us to examine what tables in our own lives might need overturning. What practices, attitudes, or systems obstruct true worship and exclude others from experiencing God's presence. Tuesday day of teaching and confrontation. The morning sun had barely risen over the Mount of Olives when Jesus and his disciples began their journey back to Jerusalem. Tuesday would prove to be a day of intense teaching and escalating conflict, perhaps Jesus' most concentrated day of public ministry during Holy Week. Knowing his time was short, Jesus packed this day with essential teachings and confrontations that would clarify the lines between the kingdom he proclaimed and the religious establishment that opposed him. Upon arriving at the temple courts, Jesus immediately drew crowds eager to hear his teaching. The previous day's temple cleansing had established him as a figure of authority who dared to challenge corruption. People pressed in around him, common laborers, merchants, women with children, even some curious Pharisees and scribes hovering at the edges. The atmosphere was electric with anticipation. The religious leaders, still smarting from their public humiliation the previous day, developed a strategy to discredit Jesus before the crowds. They would approach him with carefully crafted questions designed to trap him in his words. If they could make him stumble publicly, his influence might wane. Their first attempt came through an unlikely alliance. Pharisees and Herodians, groups usually opposed to each other, now united against a common threat. They approached with exaggerated politeness. "Teacher, we know that you are sincere and teach the way of God truthfully, without showing favoritism to anyone. Tell us then what you think. Is it lawful to pay taxes to the emperor or not?" The trap was clever. If Jesus said yes, he would alienate the crowds who resented Roman taxation. If he said no, he could be reported to the Roman authorities as advocating rebellion. Either way, his reputation would suffer. Jesus, perceiving their malice, responded, "Why are you putting me to the test, you hypocrites? Show me the coin used for the tax." When they handed him a Roman denarius, he asked, "Whose head is this? And whose title?" When they answered the emperor's, Jesus delivered his masterful reply, "Give to the emperor the things that are the emperor's, and to God the things that are God's." His questioners stood amazed, unable to trap him. His answer acknowledged legitimate secular authority, while simultaneously suggesting that human governments have limited claims compared to God's all-encompassing authority. The coin might bear Caesar's image, but humans bear God's image, implying a far deeper allegiance. Next came the Sadducees, wealthy aristocrats who controlled the temple and rejected belief in resurrection. They presented an elaborate scenario about a woman who married 7 brothers in succession, following the custom of Levirate marriage, asking whose wife she would be in the resurrection. Their question wasn't sincere, but meant to ridicule the concept of resurrection itself. Jesus' response was profound. "You are wrong, because you know neither the Scriptures nor the power of God. For in the resurrection they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are like angels in heaven. He continued by pointing out that even in the Torah, which the Sadducees claim to honor, God reveals himself as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, speaking of the patriarchs as living beings, not extinct ones. He is God not of the dead, but of the living. The watching crowd was astonished at his teaching. Even some scribes acknowledged, "Teacher, you have spoken well." Throughout the day, Jesus continued teaching through parables that grew increasingly pointed in their critique of Israel's leadership. He told the parable of the two sons, one who said he would work in a vineyard but didn't, and one who initially refused but later went. The message was clear. Tax collectors and prostitutes who repented were entering God's kingdom ahead of religious leaders who spoke righteously but failed to obey. He followed with the parable of the wicked tenants who beat and killed the landowner's servants and eventually murdered his son, hoping to seize the inheritance. When Jesus asked what the owner would do to those tenants, the crowd responded, "He will put those wretches to a miserable death and lease the vineyard to other tenants who will give him the produce at harvest time." Jesus concluded by quoting Psalm 118, "The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone." The chief priests and Pharisees realized Jesus was speaking about them, that they were the wicked tenants who had rejected God's messengers and were now plotting against God's Son. Their desire to arrest him intensified, held back only by fear of the crowds who regarded Jesus as a prophet. As the day continued, Jesus delivered some of his most scathing critiques of religious hypocrisy in what is often called the Seven Woes discourse. He denounced leaders who created burdensome rules without helping people carry them, who sought public recognition, while neglecting justice and mercy, who appeared righteous outwardly while harboring corruption within. "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites," he proclaimed, "for you are like whitewashed tombs, which on the outside look beautiful, but inside are full of the bones of the dead and of all kinds of filth." His language was shocking to those accustomed to deferring to religious authorities. He wasn't challenging minor matters, but exposing fundamental corruption at the heart of the religious establishment. Yet amid these stern denunciations, Jesus revealed his heart. "Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to it. How often have I desired to gather your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you were not willing." His critique came not from hatred, but from grieving love. Late in the afternoon, Jesus and his disciples sat on the Mount of Olives, overlooking the magnificent temple complex. The disciples, overwhelmed by the day's confrontations, sought reassurance by pointing out the temple's beauty. "Look, teacher, what wonderful stones and what wonderful buildings." Jesus' response stunned them. "Do you see these great buildings? Not one stone will be left here upon another. All will be thrown down." This prediction of the temple's destruction, fulfilled 40 years later when the Romans destroyed Jerusalem in 70 CE, led to an extended discourse about coming judgment, persecution, and eventually the return of the Son of Man in clouds with great power and glory. As the sun began to set on this day of intense teaching, Jesus concluded with parables emphasizing watchfulness and readiness. The wise and foolish bridesmaids, the talents, and the separation of sheep and goats. His message was clear. A time of accounting was coming, and what mattered was not religious performance, but genuine faith expressed through love and justice. Tuesday of Holy Week reveals Jesus at the height of his prophetic ministry, exposing religious corruption, answering challenges with wisdom that left his opponents speechless, and preparing his followers for both coming suffering and ultimate vindication. His teaching this day covered the breadth of human experience, politics, resurrection hope, religious hypocrisy, judgment, and the call to faithful living in anticipation of his return. The religious leaders, thoroughly defeated in public debate, moved from seeking to discredit Jesus to actively plotting his death. 2 days before the Passover, Matthew's Gospel tells us, the chief priests and the elders of the people gathered in the palace of the high priest, who was called Caiaphas, and they conspired to arrest Jesus by stealth and kill him. As Jesus and his disciples left the city that evening, returning to Bethany for the night, The stage was set for betrayal. Jesus had spoken truth to power, and power was preparing its violent response. Yet even now, Jesus remained in control of his destiny, his words and actions deliberately fulfilling ancient prophecies about the Messiah. The trap was being set, but Jesus was no unwitting victim. He was walking consciously toward the sacrifice he had come to make. Wednesday, the plot deepens. Wednesday of Holy Week has often been called Silent Wednesday because the Gospels record relatively few events for this day compared to the others. Yet behind the apparent calm, momentous developments were unfolding that would seal Jesus' fate. While Jesus likely spent this day teaching his disciples privately in Bethany, in Jerusalem, a conspiracy was taking lethal shape. In the high priest's palace, the Sanhedrin, Judaism's ruling council, had gathered to address what they perceived as the growing threat posed by Jesus. Caiaphas, the high priest, presided over the meeting with a grim expression. "Something must be done," he insisted. "This Galilean has gone too far. His actions in the temple were a direct challenge to our authority. If we allow him to continue, the Romans may intervene, and we will lose what little autonomy we still possess." Several members nodded in agreement. Jesus had become more than a provincial troublemaker. He now represented a potential political crisis. The Roman authorities were always watchful for signs of unrest during festivals, particularly Passover with its nationalist overtones. A messianic claimant drawing crowds and disrupting temple operations could easily provoke a brutal Roman response. "He must be arrested," one elder said, "but not during the festival, or there may be a riot among the people." Many festival pilgrims, especially those from Galilee, regarded Jesus with reverence. Any public move against him risked violent backlash. Their deliberations were interrupted when a temple guard announced an unexpected visitor. "There is a man here, one of the followers of Jesus. He wishes to speak with the council." The assembled leaders exchanged surprised glances as Judas Iscariot was ushered into their presence. What followed was one of history's most infamous betrayals. "What will you give me if I betray him to you?" Judas asked. The Gospel of Matthew records their response. They paid him 30 pieces of silver. Ironically, the price specified in Exodus for a slave's life. From that moment, Judas began looking for an opportunity to hand Jesus over when no crowd was present. What motivated Judas remains one of the great mysteries of the Passion narrative. Was it simple greed? Disillusionment with Jesus' refusal to establish a political kingdom? Resentment at being rebuked when he complained about Mary's expensive perfume wasted on Jesus? Or was there something darker at work? John's Gospel states that Satan entered into Judas, suggesting a spiritual dimension to his betrayal. Perhaps most tragically, Judas had spent 3 years in intimate fellowship with Jesus. He had witnessed the miracles, heard the teachings, and experienced Jesus' love firsthand. Yet proximity to holiness doesn't guarantee transformation. One can walk with Jesus and still maintain a heart divided by competing loyalties. Meanwhile, in Bethany, Jesus spent time with his closest friends, perhaps sensing that these were his final hours of relative peace before the storm that was coming. The Gospels suggest he stayed at the home of Simon the leper, where just days earlier Mary had anointed him with expensive perfume, prophetically preparing his body for burial. During this day of outward quiet, Jesus may have been preparing his disciples for what lay ahead. Luke's Gospel tells us, during the day Jesus was teaching at the temple, and each evening he went out to spend the night on the hill called the Mount of Olives. If this pattern held for Wednesday, Jesus would have used this time to impart final teachings to his closest followers. For the disciples, this Wednesday likely brought mixed emotions. The excitement of Palm Sunday's triumphal entry had given way to confusion about Jesus' confrontational actions in the temple and his increasingly somber predictions about coming suffering. They sensed the mounting tension between Jesus and the religious authorities, but failed to grasp how quickly events would unfold. Thomas, always the realist among the disciples, expressed concerns as they gathered that evening. "Master, the authorities are clearly plotting against you. Perhaps we should leave Jerusalem until tensions ease. Several others nodded in agreement, but Jesus' response was firm. I came for this very hour, he said quietly. What is written about me is reaching its fulfillment. The disciples exchanged troubled glances, not fully comprehending. They still clung to hopes that Jesus would somehow establish his kingdom in a way that matched their expectations, that the confrontations of the past days were preludes to a triumphant revelation of messianic power. As darkness fell on Wednesday evening, two very different scenes unfolded simultaneously. In Bethany, Jesus shared a meal with those closest to him, perhaps already aware that one of his inner circle had turned against him. In Jerusalem, religious leaders and Judas finalized their conspiracy, waiting only for the right moment to strike. Wednesday of Holy Week reminds us of the reality of betrayal, that sometimes those closest to us can wound us most deeply. It also reveals the contrast between appearances and reality. Outwardly, it seemed like a quiet day, but beneath the surface, momentous events were unfolding. Life often works this way. Significant developments take shape in silence before becoming visible to all. This day also highlights the matter of choice. Judas chose his path, just as the religious leaders chose theirs. While God's redemptive plan was being fulfilled, human responsibility remained. Each participant acted freely according to their own desires. Yet together, they unknowingly advanced God's sovereign purpose. As Wednesday ended and Thursday began, Jesus likely spent time in prayer, communing with the Father and preparing himself for the suffering that lay ahead. In less than 24 hours, he would celebrate a final Passover with his disciples, experience betrayal by a kiss, endure a mockery of justice, and face the beginning of his physical torment. The quietness of Wednesday stands in stark contrast to the events it preceded, like the stillness before a violent storm. Yet even in this relative calm, the currents of divine purpose and human choice were flowing together toward the most consequential event in human history, the sacrifice that would open the way to reconciliation between God and humanity. Thursday, the Last Supper and Garden Prayer. As the sun rose on Thursday morning, Jerusalem hummed with Passover preparations. Families cleaned their homes of leaven. Merchants sold bitter herbs and lambs for sacrifice, and pilgrims followed ancient rituals commemorating Israel's deliverance from Egypt. For observant Jews, this was the most sacred time of the year, a celebration of God's mighty acts of liberation. For Jesus and his disciples, this Passover would take on meaning beyond anything they could imagine. This would be their last meal together, and through it, Jesus would establish a new covenant and a new commemoration that would be observed by his followers for millennia to come. Earlier in the day, Jesus had sent Peter and John into the city with unusual instructions. Go and make preparations for us to eat the Passover. When they asked where, Jesus told them, as you enter the city, a man carrying a jar of water will meet you. Follow him to the house that he enters. His detailed foreknowledge suggested that these arrangements had been made in advance, perhaps to prevent Judas from revealing their location to the authorities too early. As evening approached, Jesus and the 12 gathered in a large upper room furnished for the occasion. They reclined around a low table in the Roman style, following the Passover custom of eating as free people rather than as slaves. The familiar elements of the Seder were present: bitter herbs remembering slavery's harshness, unleavened bread recalling the haste of departure from Egypt, wine representing joy and celebration. Yet this was no ordinary Passover. As they began the meal, Jesus spoke words that startled his companions. I have eagerly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. For I tell you, I will not eat it again until it finds fulfillment in the kingdom of God. The disciples exchanged uncomfortable glances. Jesus had spoken of suffering before, but the festive Passover setting made such talk seem particularly jarring. Before they could process his meaning, Jesus did something that shocked them further. He rose from the table, removed his outer garment, wrapped a towel around his waist, and began washing their feet. This task was ordinarily performed by the lowest servant in a household, Yet here was their master kneeling before them, taking the role of a slave. When he came to Peter, the fisherman protested, "Lord, are you going to wash my feet?" "You do not realize now what I am doing," Jesus replied, "but later you will understand." "No," said Peter, "you shall never wash my feet." Jesus answered, "Unless I wash you, you have no part with me." Peter, with characteristic impetuosity, switched completely. "Then, Lord, not just my feet, but my hands and my head as well." This profound, acted parable illustrated the heart of Jesus' ministry. He came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. By washing their feet, Jesus demonstrated that true greatness in his kingdom comes through humble service. After finishing, he challenged them, "Now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. I have set you an example that you should do as I have done for you." As the meal progressed, tension grew in the room. Jesus became visibly troubled and announced, "Very truly I tell you, one of you will betray me." Shocked, the disciples began questioning one another and asking Jesus, "Surely you don't mean me?" According to John's Gospel, the beloved disciple, reclining next to Jesus, asked him directly who it was. Jesus responded, "It is the one to whom I will give this piece of bread when I have dipped it in the dish." He then dipped the bread and gave it to Judas Iscariot. After receiving it, something shifted in Judas. Jesus told him, "What you are about to do, do quickly." The other disciples, still not comprehending what was unfolding, thought Jesus was sending Judas to buy supplies or give something to the poor. Judas slipped out into the night, his departure creating the opportunity for Jesus to share his most intimate teaching with those who remained loyal. As the meal continued, Jesus took bread, gave thanks, broke it, and gave it to his disciples, saying, "This is my body given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." Later he took the cup, saying, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood, which is poured out for you." With these simple yet profound actions, Jesus transformed the ancient Passover into something new. The unleavened bread and wine would no longer primarily commemorate Israel's deliverance from Egypt, but would now represent his body and blood offered for humanity's redemption from sin. He was establishing what Christians would later call communion or the Eucharist, a sacred meal of remembrance and participation in his sacrifice. The hours that followed were filled with some of Jesus' most profound teaching, recorded especially in John's Gospel. He spoke of his coming departure, the promised Holy Spirit, the vine and branches, and the hatred they would face from the world. He assured them of his peace, warned of coming persecution, and promised ultimate victory. Then Jesus lifted his eyes toward heaven and prayed what has become known as his high priestly prayer, first for himself, then for his disciples, and finally for all who would later believe through their message. This extraordinary prayer revealed Jesus' heart for unity among his followers and his desire that they might share in his glory through knowing the Father. After the prayer, they sang a hymn, likely from the Hallel Psalms traditionally sung at Passover, and left for the Garden of Gethsemane on the Mount of Olives. The night had grown late, and most of Jerusalem slept, unaware of the cosmic drama unfolding in their midst. In the garden, under ancient olive trees that still stand today, Jesus withdrew from most of his disciples, taking only Peter, James, and John deeper in the garden. "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death," he told them. "Stay here and keep watch with me." Then he went a little farther, fell with his face to the ground, and prayed, "My Father, if it is possible, may this cup be taken from me. Yet not as I will, but as you will." The cup Jesus referred to was multi-layered in meaning. It represented the wrath of God against sin that he would bear, the physical suffering he would endure, and the spiritual agony of being separated from the Father. Luke's Gospel tells us his anguish was so intense that his sweat was like drops of blood falling to the ground, a rare medical condition called hematidrosis that occurs under extreme stress. 3 times Jesus returned to find his disciples sleeping, their eyes heavy with exhaustion, wine, and sorrow. "Could you not keep watch with me for 1 hour?" he asked Peter. Watch and pray so that you will not fall into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. Jesus' struggle in Gethsemane reveals his full humanity. He did not approach the cross with stoic detachment, but with very human dread and sorrow. Yet ultimately, he surrendered completely to the Father's will. His prayer moved from, "If it is possible, may this cup be taken from me," to the resolute, "My Father, if it is not possible for this cup to be taken away unless I drink it, may your will be done." Just as Jesus finished praying, the betrayal he had predicted began to unfold. Torch lights appeared on the path from Jerusalem. A contingent of temple guards led by Judas approached the garden. Judas had arranged a signal. "The one I kiss is the man. Arrest him." With this most intimate gesture of friendship perverted into treachery, Judas identified Jesus to the guards. "Judas, are you betraying the Son of Man with a kiss?" Jesus asked, his last words to the one who had walked with him for 3 years, but now had turned against him. As the guards moved to arrest Jesus, Peter drew a sword and struck the high priest's servant, cutting off his ear. Jesus immediately commanded, "Put your sword away," and healed the injured man. Then he addressed the armed crowd. "Am I leading a rebellion that you have come out with swords and clubs? Every day I was with you in the temple courts, and you did not lay a hand on me. But this is your hour when darkness reigns." With that, all the disciples fled, fulfilling Jesus' earlier prediction that they would all fall away. He was led away alone to face trials before the Jewish authorities and then Pilate, the first steps on his journey to the cross. Thursday of Holy Week reveals profound contrasts. The intimacy of the Last Supper alongside the loneliness of Gethsemane. The loving service of foot washing followed by the betrayal of a kiss. The new covenant established even as the old covenant leaders plotted Jesus' death. It shows Jesus fully in control of events, yet also fully human in his emotional and physical suffering. Most importantly, Thursday reveals that Jesus chose the path to the cross. Despite his natural human desire to avoid suffering, he freely submitted to the Father's will, knowing that through his sacrifice, a way would be opened for humanity's reconciliation with God. At any point, he could have called 12 legions of angels to rescue him, but he chose to drink the cup of suffering out of love for us. Good Friday, the crucifixion. The darkness of early Friday morning concealed a flurry of illegal activity as Jesus was shuttled between authorities in a mockery of justice. After his arrest in Gethsemane, he was first taken to Annas, father-in-law of the high priest Caiaphas, for preliminary questioning. This was the beginning of a series of trials, some before Jewish authorities, others before Roman, that violated numerous legal protocols but served to create a veneer of legitimacy for what was essentially judicial murder. The Jewish religious leaders faced a dilemma. They wanted Jesus eliminated but lacked the authority to execute him. Only the Roman governor could impose capital punishment. They needed to find charges that would convince Pilate to act against Jesus, so they conducted a hurried nighttime trial before the Sanhedrin, seeking testimony that would justify a death sentence. Many testified falsely against him, but their statements did not agree. Mark's gospel tells us. Finally, the high priest directly challenged Jesus. "Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One?" Jesus' response sealed his fate. "I am, and you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven." The high priest tore his clothes in a display of horror at what he deemed blasphemy. "Why do we need any more witnesses?" he asked. "You have heard the blasphemy." The council declared Jesus worthy of death, and as they waited for dawn when they could legally approach Pilate, some began to mock Jesus, spitting in his face and striking him with their fists. Meanwhile, a painful drama unfolded in the courtyard outside. Peter, who had followed at a distance, warmed himself by a fire among the servants and guards. 3 times he was identified as one of Jesus' followers, and 3 times he denied knowing him, just as Jesus had predicted. After the 3rd denial, a rooster crowed, and Jesus, being led from one hearing to another, turned and looked directly at Peter. Overcome with shame, Peter went outside and wept bitterly. As dawn broke over Jerusalem, Jesus was taken to Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor who had come to Jerusalem from Caesarea specifically for the Passover festival, when the risk of Jewish unrest was highest. Before Pilate, the religious leaders shifted their accusations from blasphemy, which would not interest Roman authorities, to sedition. "We found this man subverting our nation, forbidding payment of taxes to Caesar, and claiming to be Messiah, a king." Pilate, a cynical political appointee with a reputation for brutality, questioned Jesus. "Are you the king of the Jews?" "You have said so," Jesus replied. But when further accusations were made against him, he gave no answer, amazing Pilate with his silence. Learning that Jesus was from Galilee, Pilate saw a political opportunity to shift responsibility and sent Jesus to Herod Antipas, the ruler of Galilee who happened to be in Jerusalem for Passover. Herod was fascinated to finally meet Jesus, having heard much about his miracles, and hoped to see a demonstration of power. When Jesus refused to perform or even answer his questions, Herod and his soldiers ridiculed him, dressing him in an elegant robe as a mock king before sending him back to Pilate. Upon Jesus' return, Pilate attempted a political solution. It was customary during Passover to release a prisoner as a goodwill gesture. He offered the crowd a choice between Jesus and Barabbas, a notorious insurrectionist. To Pilate's surprise, the crowd, incited by the chief priests, shouted for Barabbas' release and Jesus' crucifixion. "What shall I do, then, with Jesus who is called the Messiah?" Pilate asked. "Crucify him," they shouted. "Why? What crime has he committed?" Pilate demanded. But they shouted all the louder, "Crucify him." Seeing that he was getting nowhere and that a riot was imminent, Pilate took water and washed his hands in front of the crowd. "I am innocent of this man's blood," he declared. "It is your responsibility." Then he released Barabbas and handed Jesus over to be flogged and crucified. Roman flogging was so brutal that some victims died before reaching crucifixion. Using a multi-lashed whip embedded with bone and metal fragments, soldiers tore the flesh from Jesus' back, reducing it to a bloody mass of tissue. After the flogging, they placed a crown of thorns on his head, threw a purple robe over his shoulders, and mockingly hailed him as King of the Jews. They struck him in the face, spit on him, and knelt in mock homage. When they tired of their sport, they placed a crossbeam on Jesus' shoulders and led him through Jerusalem's streets toward Golgotha, the place of the skull, where executions were carried out. Weakened by blood loss, lack of sleep, and the beatings, Jesus stumbled under the weight. The soldiers pressed a passerby from Cyrene named Simon into service, forcing him to carry the cross the rest of the way. Among the crowd following the procession were women from Jerusalem, weeping at the sight of Jesus' suffering. Despite his own agony, Jesus turned to them with compassion. "Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me. Weep for yourselves and for your children." He foresaw the coming destruction of Jerusalem that would occur within a generation and the suffering these women and their families would endure. At Golgotha, soldiers offered Jesus wine mixed with myrrh, a mild analgesic to dull the pain. But he refused it, choosing to endure the full suffering with clear consciousness. They laid him on the cross, driving heavy iron spikes through his wrists and feet, then hoisted the cross upright, dropping it with a jolt into a prepared hole. Above his head, they placed Pilate's inscription, "Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews," written in Hebrew, Latin, and Greek. When the chief priests objected, wanting it to say that Jesus only claimed to be king, Pilate refused to change it, perhaps a small act of defiance against those who had forced his hand. Crucifixion was designed not just to kill, but to humiliate. Victims were usually crucified naked, exposed to the elements and public ridicule, suffering a slow death that could take days as they gradually lost strength, struggled to breathe, and succumbed to exhaustion and asphyxiation. Yet even in this most degrading execution, Jesus demonstrated the character that had defined his ministry. "Father, forgive them," he prayed for his executioners, "for they do not know what they are doing." When one of the two criminals crucified with him expressed faith, Jesus promised, Truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise." Seeing his mother Mary and the disciple John standing nearby, he established a new family bond between them. "Woman, here is your son," and to John, "Here is your mother." Around noon, an eerie darkness fell over the land, lasting for 3 hours. This supernatural darkness symbolized the spiritual reality of what was happening. The light of the world was being extinguished, bearing the weight of humanity's sin. In this darkness, Jesus cried out in Aramaic words from Psalm 22, "Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" This cry revealed the deepest agony of the cross. Not just physical torture, but spiritual separation, as Jesus, who had known perfect communion with the Father throughout eternity, now experienced the horror of sin separation. Later Jesus said, "I thirst," and was offered wine vinegar on a sponge. Finally, knowing that all was completed, Jesus called out in triumph, rather than defeat, "It is finished." With these words, he declared not failure, but accomplishment. The work of redemption was complete. Then he said, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit," and breathed his last. At that moment, the earth shook, rocks split, and most significantly, the curtain in the temple that separated the Holy of Holies from the rest of the sanctuary was torn in two from top to bottom, signifying that access to God was now open to all through Christ's sacrifice. The centurion overseeing the execution, witnessing these events and Jesus' manner of death, declared, "Surely this man was the Son of God." As evening approached, bringing the beginning of Sabbath, it was crucial that the bodies be removed before sunset. Joseph of Arimathea, a wealthy member of the Sanhedrin who had not consented to Jesus' condemnation, approached Pilate for permission to take Jesus' body for burial. Together with Nicodemus, another secret disciple, he wrapped Jesus' body with spices and linen according to Jewish burial customs and placed it in a new tomb cut into rock. A large stone was rolled across the entrance, and the women who had followed Jesus noted the location, planning to return after Sabbath to complete the burial preparations. At the religious leaders' request, Pilate ordered the tomb sealed and placed under guard to prevent any attempt by the disciples to steal the body and claim resurrection. With these precautions, they believed they had finally eliminated the threat Jesus posed to their authority and traditions. Good Friday stands as history's darkest yet most hopeful day, when human evil reached its apex in the murder of God's Son, yet divine love triumphed through that very sacrifice. What appeared to be defeat was actually victory. What seemed to be the end was actually the beginning. Through Jesus' willing sacrifice, the power of sin and death was broken, and the way was opened for humanity's reconciliation with God. Saturday, the Great Silence. Holy Saturday exists in the biblical narrative mainly as negative space, a day defined by what didn't happen rather than what did. The Gospels tell us almost nothing about this day, except that it was Sabbath and that Jesus' body lay in the tomb while his followers observed the required Sabbath rest. Yet this silence speaks volumes about the experience of Jesus' followers in those dark hours between crucifixion and resurrection. For the disciples, Saturday was a day of desolation, confusion, and fear. They had abandoned Jesus in his hour of need, with only John reportedly present at the crucifixion. Now, they huddled behind locked doors, terrified that the authorities who had executed their master might come for them next. Their 3 years of following Jesus seemed to have ended in catastrophic failure. Simon Peter perhaps felt the pain most acutely. He had sworn he would die with Jesus rather than deny him. Yet when tested, he had denied knowing Jesus 3 times. Now his bold promises lay in ashes, and he was left to wrestle with his failure and what it revealed about his character. The Gospels don't record his thoughts, but his grief must have been overwhelming, not just for Jesus' death, but for his own cowardice in the face of it. The women who had followed Jesus from Galilee experienced Saturday differently. Unlike the male disciples who feared for their lives, the women were making practical preparations, purchasing spices and ointments to properly anoint Jesus' body once Sabbath ended. Their love continued to express itself in concrete action even when hope seemed lost. Luke tells us they rested on the Sabbath in obedience to the commandment, their grief contained within the ancient rhythms of their faith. For Mary, Jesus' mother, Holy Saturday must have been almost unbearable. Simeon had prophesied when Jesus was an infant that a sword will pierce your own soul, and now that prophecy had been fulfilled in the most horrific way imaginable. She had witnessed her son's torture and execution, had seen the spear pierce his side, had helped prepare his broken body for burial. Now she waited in the liminal space between death and whatever might come next. Jerusalem itself continued its Passover celebrations, largely unaware of the cosmic significance of what had occurred. Pilgrims filled the streets, sacrifices continued in the temple, and families gathered for ritual meals. For most residents and visitors, the execution of yet another Galilean troublemaker was hardly noteworthy. Only a few understood that history itself had pivoted on Friday afternoon. Yet unseen behind the silence and apparent defeat of Saturday, mysterious events were unfolding. Peter's first letter cryptically mentions that after his death, Christ went and made proclamation to the imprisoned spirits, and the Apostles' Creed would later state that he descended to the dead. Christian tradition has long pondered what exactly happened while Jesus' body lay in the tomb. Was he proclaiming victory over evil powers? Was he liberating the righteous who had died before his coming? The details remain mysterious, but the significance is clear. Even in death, Jesus was accomplishing his redemptive purposes. Meanwhile, despite their precautions, the religious authorities remained uneasy. Matthew tells us they approached Pilate on Saturday, saying, "Sir, we remember that while he was still alive, that deceiver said, 'After 3 days I will rise again.' So give the order for the tomb to be made secure until the 3rd day. Otherwise, his disciples may come and steal the body and tell the people that he has been raised from the dead. This last deception will be worse than the first." Pilate granted their request for a guard and the official sealing of the tomb. Ironically, these precautions would later serve to validate the resurrection, making it impossible to dismiss reports of the empty tomb as mere theft or deception. Holy Saturday reveals a profound theological truth. Sometimes God's greatest work happens in silence, in darkness, when nothing seems to be happening. The disciples experienced Saturday as God's absence, but it was actually a necessary pause in the divine narrative, the silence before the symphony, the darkness before dawn. This day also speaks to the universal human experience of waiting in darkness. Those times when hope seems lost, when God appears silent, when what we believed in seems to have failed. Holy Saturday reminds us that such times, though painful, are not the end of the story. While the disciples saw only defeat, God was preparing an unimaginable victory. The Sabbath restrictions that kept the women from completing Jesus' burial anointing also preserved the evidence of resurrection. Had they been able to visit the tomb on Saturday, they might have discovered the empty tomb without witnesses, creating more confusion. The timing of Sabbath ensured they would come at dawn on Sunday, when angels would be present to interpret the empty tomb correctly. As the sun set on Saturday, ending the Sabbath, no one on earth anticipated what was about to happen. The disciples had no expectation of resurrection, despite Jesus having predicted it multiple times. Even the women who would visit the tomb at dawn were coming to anoint a corpse, not greet a risen Lord. Yet in hours, everything would change. The great silence of Saturday was about to be broken by history's most joyful proclamation. Easter Sunday, resurrection. Before dawn on Sunday morning, while Jerusalem still slept, something extraordinary happened that would forever alter human history. In the quiet darkness of Joseph of Arimathea's garden tomb, life conquered death. The body of Jesus, lifeless since Friday afternoon, suddenly pulsed with new vitality, not merely resuscitated, but transformed into a resurrection body that transcended ordinary physical limitations. Matthew's Gospel describes dramatic accompaniments to this supreme miracle. there was a violent earthquake, for an angel of the Lord came down from heaven and, going to the tomb, rolled back the stone and sat on it. His appearance was like lightning, and his clothes were white as snow. The guards were so afraid of him that they shook and became like dead men. The stone wasn't rolled away to let Jesus out. His resurrection body could later pass through locked doors, but to let witnesses in to see that the tomb was indeed empty. The guards, hardened Roman soldiers, were so overwhelmed by the angelic presence that they temporarily lost consciousness. When they recovered, they fled to report what had happened to the chief priests, who bribed them to spread the story that the disciples had stolen the body while they slept. As dawn approached, a small group of women made their way through Jerusalem's quiet streets toward the tomb. Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, Salome, and Joanna carried spices to complete the burial preparations that the hasty Friday entombment and intervening Sabbath had prevented. Their hearts were heavy with grief, and they worried about a practical problem. Who will roll the stone away from the entrance of the tomb? The massive disc-shaped stone would be far too heavy for them to move. To their astonishment, they found the stone already rolled away and the tomb empty except for the burial cloths. While they stood confused and frightened, two men in gleaming clothes appeared beside them. "Why do you look for the living among the dead?" they asked. "He is not here. He has risen. Remember how he told you, while he was still with you in Galilee. The Son of Man must be delivered over to the hands of sinners, be crucified, and on the third day be raised again." The women, both terrified and filled with joy, ran to tell the disciples. Most of the men dismissed their words as nonsense, but Peter and John raced to the tomb to see for themselves. John, arriving first, peered inside and saw the burial cloths. Peter, characteristically impulsive, rushed past him into the tomb and saw the linen wrappings lying there, with the cloth that had been on Jesus' head rolled up in a place by itself. Not the chaotic scene of grave robbery, but the orderly evidence of resurrection. Mary Magdalene, having returned to the tomb after initially informing the disciples, remained outside weeping. She bent down to look inside again and saw two angels seated where Jesus' body had been. "Woman, why are you crying?" they asked. "They have taken my Lord away," she replied, "and I don't know where they have put him." Turning around, she saw a man she assumed was the gardener. "Sir, if you have carried him away," she pleaded, "tell me where you have put him, and I will get him." Jesus spoke just one word, "Mary." At the sound of her name, spoken by the unmistakable voice of her teacher, recognition dawned. "Rabboni," she exclaimed, reaching toward him. "Do not hold on to me," Jesus said, "for I have not yet ascended to the Father. Go instead to my brothers and tell them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." Mary Magdalene became the first witness of the resurrection, the apostle to the apostles, who proclaimed to Jesus' followers, "I have seen the Lord." Jesus' appearance to her first, a woman whose testimony would not even be valid in Jewish courts of that time, demonstrates how his kingdom overturns human hierarchies and prejudices. The resurrection was first announced not to religious leaders or even to the 12 disciples, but to women who had faithfully followed Jesus and now came to serve him even in death. Later that same day, two disciples were walking to Emmaus, discussing the confusing events of the weekend, when Jesus himself joined them, though they were kept from recognizing him. He asked what they were discussing, and they told him about the crucifixion and the strange reports from the women about an empty tomb. "We had hoped that he was the one who was going to redeem Israel," they said, their disappointment evident. Jesus responded, "How foolish you are, and how slow to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Did not the Messiah have to suffer these things and then enter his glory?" Beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them what was said in all the scriptures concerning himself. Their hearts burned within them as he spoke, though they still didn't recognize him. When they reached Emmaus, they urged their companion to stay with them, since evening was approaching. As they ate together, Jesus took bread, gave thanks, broke it, and began to give it to them. And suddenly their eyes were opened, and they recognized him. At that moment, he disappeared from their sight. Despite the late hour, they rushed back to Jerusalem to tell. the others. That evening, the disciples were gathered behind locked doors, fearing the Jewish authorities, when Jesus suddenly stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." They were startled and frightened, thinking they saw a ghost, but Jesus reassured them. "Look at my hands and my feet. It is I myself. Touch me and see. A ghost does not have flesh and bones, as you see I have." When they still struggled to believe, he asked, "Do you have anything here to eat?" They gave him a piece of broiled fish, and he ate it in their presence, demonstrating that he had a real, physical body, not just a spiritual apparition. Then he opened their minds to understand the scriptures, showing how his death and resurrection fulfilled what was written. Thomas, who had been absent during this appearance, expressed doubts when the others told him they had seen the Lord. "Unless I see the nail marks in his hands, and put my finger where the nails were, and put my hand into his side, I will not believe." A week later, Jesus appeared again when Thomas was present. "Put your finger here, see my hands," he invited. "Reach out your hand and put it into my side. Stop doubting and believe." Thomas fell to his knees, exclaiming, "My Lord and my God." Jesus replied, "Because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed," a blessing intended for all who would later believe through the testimony of the apostles. The risen Jesus continued appearing to his followers for 40 days, providing many convincing proofs that he was alive, according to Acts. These appearances weren't subjective visions, but encounters with a physically resurrected person who could be touched, who ate food, who bore the marks of crucifixion, yet was somehow transformed. The disciples, who had fled in fear at his arrest, were so convinced by these experiences that they later willingly faced persecution and martyrdom rather than deny the resurrection. Perhaps the most moving post-resurrection appearance occurred by the Sea of Galilee, where Jesus had first called several of the disciples. Peter and 6 others had gone fishing, but caught nothing all night. As dawn broke, a figure on the shore called out, "Friends, haven't you any fish?" When they answered no, he told them, "Throw your net on the right side of the boat, and you'll find some." When they did, they caught so many fish they couldn't haul in the net. John immediately recognized the echo of their earlier calling. "It is the Lord." Peter impulsively jumped into the water and swam ashore while the others followed in the boat. On the beach, they found Jesus cooking breakfast over a charcoal fire, bread and fish, a humble meal prepared by the risen Lord for his tired followers. After they ate, Jesus addressed the unresolved pain of Peter's triple denial by asking him 3 times, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Each time Peter affirmed his love, and Jesus responded with a commission, "Feed my lambs. Take care of my sheep. Feed my sheep." This gentle restoration healed Peter's shame and prepared him for leadership in the early church. Easter Sunday and the appearances that followed transformed a band of frightened, demoralized followers into bold proclaimers of the resurrection. Their certainty wasn't based on blind faith or wishful thinking, but on repeated encounters with the risen Christ. As Peter would later declare to the very authorities who had condemned Jesus, "We cannot help speaking about what we have seen and heard." The resurrection isn't merely a happy ending to an otherwise tragic story. It's the central event of history, the validation of Jesus' claims, the defeat of death itself, and the promise of our own future resurrection. Paul would later write, "If Christ has not been raised, our preaching is useless, and so is your faith." Christianity stands or falls on this reality. The tomb was empty, and Jesus was alive. From those first witnesses forward, the message of Easter has echoed through history. Christ is risen. He is risen indeed. This proclamation has transformed countless lives across cultures and centuries, offering hope in the face of death, meaning in the face of despair, and the promise that love is stronger than hate, life stronger than death, and good ultimately stronger than evil. The journey continues. The resurrection of Jesus was not the end of the story, but a new beginning. For 40 days afterward, the risen Christ appeared to his followers, teaching them about the kingdom of God and preparing them for their mission. Before ascending to heaven, he commissioned them, Go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. This commission extends to all who follow Jesus today. The events of Holy Week, the humble entry, the self-giving love, the sacrificial death, the triumphant resurrection, are not merely to be remembered, but to be lived. We are called to embody the same love that led Jesus to the cross, to demonstrate the same forgiveness he offered from it, and to live in the power of his resurrection. As we reflect on this sacred journey from Palm Sunday to Easter, three profound lessons emerge. First, God's ways often confound human expectations. The crowds welcomed Jesus as a conquering king, but rejected him when he revealed a different kind of kingdom. Even his closest followers struggled to understand that his victory would come through apparent defeat. Today, we too must remain open to God, working in ways that surprise us. Second, suffering and glory are mysteriously intertwined in God's redemptive plan. Jesus' path to resurrection led through the cross. His glory was revealed precisely in his willing sacrifice. This pattern suggests that our own suffering, when surrendered to God, can become a pathway to unexpected blessing and transformation. Finally, the resurrection assures us that death, despair, and evil do not have the final word. No matter how dark our Saturday, our time of waiting and uncertainty, Sunday is coming. The power that raised Jesus from the dead is at work in our world and in our lives, bringing renewal and hope even from situations that seem beyond redemption. What questions does this journey stir in your heart? Perhaps you wonder about the depth of love that would lead God himself to endure such suffering. Maybe you question how this ancient story connects to your daily challenges. Or perhaps you struggle to believe that something so extraordinary could actually be true. Whatever your questions, they're welcome. Faith doesn't mean absence of questions, but willingness to seek answers. How has this reflection on Holy Week touched your own life? Have you recognized yourself in Peter's failings or Thomas's doubts? Have you felt the weight of Friday's darkness in your own experiences of loss or betrayal? Have you glimpsed Sunday's hope breaking through in unexpected moments of grace and renewal? The events of Holy Week become most meaningful when they illuminate our own spiritual journeys. I encourage you to continue exploring the depths of this world-changing week. Read the gospel accounts for yourself. Discuss them with others. Reflect on how they might reshape your understanding of love, suffering, forgiveness, and hope. The story of Holy Week is not just history. It's an invitation to transformation. Thank you for joining me on this journey through Holy Week. I would love to hear your thoughts and perspectives in the comments below. How do these events speak to your own faith journey? What insights or questions emerged as you reflected on them? Your voice is an important part of this ongoing conversation about the significance of Jesus' final week. If you found this exploration meaningful, please consider subscribing to the Deep Bible Stories channel. Each week, we dive into the rich narratives of Scripture, uncovering layers of meaning that can transform our understanding and deepen our faith. Together, we can continue exploring the stories that have shaped human history and continue to shape lives today.